Good day, everyone. I'm Eligible Leong from Marketing 3-2, and today I'll be discussing the article of Gloria Steinem entitled If Men Could Menstruate. Before diving into the article, here are the learning objectives of this discussion. First, identify the author of the article. Second, explain the definition of menstruation. Third, illustrate the view of Gloria Steinem in If Men Could Menstruate and know its purpose. And here are the questions meant to be answered. First, what would happen if magically men could menstruate and women could not? Second, and how would women train to react? Before we start, what comes into your mind when you saw this picture? You're right. These are associated with girls' monthly period or also called menstruation. So what is menstruation? Menstruation occurs when the uterus lining sheds and breaks down into blood. This blood is then released from the body through the vagina. It is also referred to as a period and is only exclusive with women. And now let us all listen to the Mary Lewis reads the article If Men Could Menstruate.
Reading Freud made me skeptical about penis envy. The power of giving birth makes womb envy more logical, and an organ as external and unprotected as the penis makes men very vulnerable indeed. But listening recently to a woman describe the unexpected arrival of her menstrual period, a red stain had spread on her dress as she argued heatedly on the public stage, still made me cringe with embarrassment. That is, until she explained that, when finally informed in whispers of the obvious event, she said to the all male audience, "And you should be proud to have a menstruating woman on your stage. It's probably the first real thing that's happened to this group in years." Laughter, relief. She had turned a negative into a positive. So, what would happen if suddenly, magically, men could menstruate and women could not? Clearly, menstruation would become an enviable, worthy masculine event. Men would brag about how long and how much. Young boys would talk about it as the envied beginning of manhood. Gifts, religious ceremonies, family dinners, and stag parties would mark the day. To prevent monthly work loss among the powerful, Congress would fund a National Institute of Dysmenorrhea. Doctors would research little about heart attacks from which men would hormonally be protected, but everything about cramps. Sanitary supplies would be federally funded and free, of course. Some men would still pay for the prestige of such commercial brands as Paul Newman tampons, Muhammad Ali's rope a dope pads, and Joe Namath jock shields for those light bachelor days. Statistical surveys would show that men did better in sports and won more Olympic medals during their periods. Generals, right wing politicians, and religious fundamentalists would cite menstruation, as proof that only men could serve God and country in combat. You have to give blood to take blood. Occupy high political office, be priests, ministers, or rabbis. Male liberals and radicals, however, would insist that women are equal, just different, and that any woman could join their ranks if only she were willing to recognize the primacy of menstrual rights. Everything else is a single issue. Or self inflict a major wound every month. You must give blood for the revolution. Street guys would invent slang. He's a 3-pad man. And give fives on the corner with some exchange like, "Man, you looking good." "Yeah, man, I'm on the rag." Men would convince women that sex was more pleasurable at that time of the month. Lesbians would be said to fear blood and therefore life itself, though all they needed was a good menstruating man. Medical schools would limit women's entry. They might faint at the sight of blood. Of course, intellectuals would offer the most moral and logical arguments. Without the biological gift for measuring the cycles of the moon and the planets, how could a woman master any discipline that demanded a sense of time, space, mathematics, or the ability to measure anything at all? In philosophy and religion, how could women compensate for being disconnected from the rhythm of the universe, or for their lack of symbolic death and resurrection every month? Menopause would be celebrated as a positive event, the symbol that men had accumulated enough years of cyclical woman wisdom to need no more. And how would women be trained to react? One can imagine right wing women agreeing to all these arguments with a staunch and smiling masochism. The era would force housewives to wound themselves every month. Phyllis Scoutfly. In short, we would discover, as we should already, that logic is in the eye of the logician. For instance, here's an idea for theorists and logicians. If women are supposed to be less rational and more emotional at the beginning of our menstrual cycle when the female hormone is at its lowest level, then why isn't it logical to say that in those few days, women behave the most like the way men behave all month long? I leave further improvisation up to you. The truth is that if men could menstruate, the power justifications would go on and on if we let them.
As revealed by Stanim's question, so what would happen if suddenly magically men could menstruate but women could not? But before answering that question, let me first introduce the author of the article. So Gloria Steinem, a freelance writer and activist for women's rights, was born on March 25, 1934 in Toledo, Ohio. Steinem began her career as a freelance writer in 1956 after earning a degree in literature in 1963. She earned a recognition when she wrote an article in Show magazine on New York City's Playboy Club, which graphically revealed the working circumstances women were forced to suffer, including catcalling and abusive mistreatment by men. Steinem co-founded the National Women's Political Caucus and Miss Magazine in 1971 with other prominent feminists of the time. However, Steinem was diagnosed with breast cancer in 1986, which she ultimately overcame that same year. Steinem, who is still active and well today, continues to advocate for women's rights through her publications and nonviolent protests. The author uses the third person point of view to discuss modern culture. Unfortunately, women are often the targets of sexism. Using a hypothetical point of view, Steinem writes in a situation in which a man would become feminine, as indicated by menstruation, and so produce a culture where these traditionally feminine qualities are highly desirable. Steinem, a product of the second half of the 20th century, was profoundly affected by the movements for women's equality, particularly those of the 1970s, the sexual revolution. The author lived through a period when hundreds of women gathered to shine as an example and fight for women's rights to have their voices heard as equals among men. Steinem heavily endorses her views and if men could menstruate with the purpose of empowering women and encouraging sex equality. So, what is the content of this article? So, If Men Could Menstruate is a short piece that explores the background and modern manifestations of sexism. Steinem argues that the idea that the menstruation is a sign of male superiority is not only illogical but also misogynistic because whatever a superior group has will be used to justify its superiority, and whatever inferior group has will be used to justify its plight. Logic has nothing to do with oppression. Since men are biologically unable to menstruate, Steinem find the author's claim that they will use any excuse to feel superior to women utterly ridiculous. When men can menstruate and women cannot, however, men will exert their dominance. The author illustrates this point by saying, in short, we would discover, as we should already know, that logic is in the eye of the logician. Even though there are no clear major or minor characters in the text, Steinem shows herself as a proper character, a woman who is a feminist. She talks about herself as a woman and a feminist by adding, reading Freud made me just as skeptical about penis envy. The power of giving birth makes womb envy more logical, and an organ as external and unprotected as the penis makes men very vulnerable, which shows that she is a supporter of feminism and gender equality in general. Steinem shows that the bad guys are all people who have a reason to be angry. She quoted, generals, right wing politicians, and religious fundamentalists would cite menstruation as proof that only men could serve God and country in combat. The central theme of If Men Could Menstruate is that men are willing to use any justification to feel superior to the other sex, including the ability to menstruate. Steinem strives for gender equality, but she is persistently obstructed by men who feel they have the right to do so, that women are inferior because they lack male characteristics, as evidenced by her statement. Reading Freud made me equally skeptical about Venice envy. The ability to give birth makes womb envy more logical, and an organ as external and unprotected as the penis makes men extremely vulnerable. Males will have reason to feel superior based on sex, she suggests, even though these organs render males more vulnerable than females. The author asserts that if men could menstruate but women could not, men would use it as a symbol of superiority. So to answer Stanim's question, so what would happen if suddenly, magically, men could menstruate but women could not? Clearly, menstruation would become an inviolable, worthy, and masculine event, with men bragging about how long and how much it lasted. Young boys would discuss it as the beginning of manhood that they coveted. Gifts, religious ceremonies, the day would be dominated by family dinners and stag parties. Menstruation, however, is exclusive to women. Therefore, if men had it in modern society, they would be ridiculed rather than praised. Collectively, the author asserts that women should speak their minds because they are equal to men. Despite the gender bias of the opposite sex, because if men were suddenly able to menstruate, they will use it to their advantage instead of becoming it as a weakness. So the short work by Steinem is satirical because it mocks those who believe men are superior to women due to their gender. Author's tone is both satirical and mocking when she ridicules men who justify menstruation as an admirable trait if women were unable to menstruate as well. This is evident when she writes, men would boast about how long and how much. Young boys would enviously discuss it as the beginning of manhood. The statement complements her tone because she is mocking men who would dare to boast about their superior attributes in relation to menstruation, thus mocking males for the belief that men are superior because women cannot menstruate. In this article, Stanim explains how the characteristics of the powerful are thought to be better than the characteristics of the powerless. As an example, she theorized what would happen if men were to menstruate. Since they are seen as the more powerful group, menstruation would be envied. The government would have a national institute to federally fund sanitary supplies. The military would cite menstruation as proof that only men could join the military. This article was a great way to show how the powerful would radicalize their opinions and circumstances if they were allowed to, because that is what the powerful is meant to do. It exemplifies the idea that the powerless will always envy the powerful no matter how illogical it is. Moving on to the second question, how would women trained to react? Gloria Steinem answered this question by stating that one can imagine right-wing women agreeing to all of these arguments with a staunch and smiling masochism. Reformers and queen bees would adjust their lives to the cycles of the men around them. Feminists would explain endlessly that men, too, needed to be liberated from the false idea of Martin aggressiveness, just as women needed to escape the bonds of men's envy. Radical feminists would add that the oppression of the non-menstrual was the pattern for all other oppression. Cultural feminists would exalt a bloodless female imagery in art and literature. Socialist feminists would insist that once capitalism and imperialism were overthrown, women would menstruate too. Society say to women, you can aim for success, but not too much. You can be whatever you want, but you have limits because you cannot outshine men. We teach our boys to become great men so they can achieve a career by becoming lawyers, doctors, or engineers. But we don't teach our girls the same. But instead, we teach girls to aspire marriage, have kids, and take care of the household. Taking menstrual away from women would make us less feminine. Women wouldn't be able to have kids. This would be a male dominated world and men will have total control over women. As a conclusion, If Man Could Menstruate is nonfiction because it presents the subjective viewpoint of a woman on the world and feminism. Steinem's essay is sharp as a razor and full of brilliance as she makes an obvious connection between institutionalized inequality and the way women are treated. Steinem argues that, contrary to what one might expect, transposing the dominant cultural associations with menstruation onto the bodies of men would increase rather than diminish their masculine power. Before I end this presentation, I'll share to you this empowering discussion of Gloria Steinem on why you should be a feminist. And now, ending this presentation with a quote, we need to remember across generations that there is so much to learn as there is to teach. I hope you learn a lot from this presentation. Thank you and enjoy watching.